In the 14th century, in a quiet village in medieval England, death was not always an end. Sometimes it was a beginning. On a gray autumn morning, the church bells rang not for a funeral, but for a ritual few truly understood. Villagers gathered in silence as a young woman, pale but composed, stood before the stone walls of the parish church. She had chosen this life, if it could still be called life. She was to become an anchoress. The ceremony resembled a burial. Prayers were whispered as if for the dead. Holy water touched her forehead. A final blessing was given. Then she stepped into a narrow stone chamber built against the church wall, no larger than a prison cell. Inside there was little more than a wooden cot, a crucifix, and darkness. The entrance was sealed with bricks and mortar, while the villagers watched. Each stone pressed into place erased a piece of the outside world. When the final gap was closed, only a small slit remained, barely wide enough to pass bread and water through. She would never walk freely again. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Through the thin window facing the altar, she prayed. Through another opening, she offered spiritual counsel to those who came seeking it. But isolation has weight, and in the stillness of stone, even whispers begin to feel alive. Soon, the villagers would hear things that were never meant to escape that wall. At first, the sounds were dismissed as imagination. The anchoress had lived within the stone chamber for nearly a year when the priest began to notice a change in her voice. Through the narrow opening where she confessed and offered counsel, her tone had grown strained, quieter, uncertain. She spoke of movement in the dark, of breathing that was not her own. The priest reminded her that solitude tests the mind, that the devil tempts the faithful most fiercely when they are closest to God. She apologized, but the sounds continued. At night, when the village lay still beneath a cold English sky, faint scratching echoed from the church walls. Parishioners who lived nearby claimed they heard murmuring long after midnight prayers had ended. Not prayer, not weeping, whispering. One evening, a young altar boy bringing bread paused at the small opening in the stone. Before he could knock, he heard her speaking inside. But she was not praying. Her voice trembled as if responding to someone unseen. "No," she whispered urgently, "you do not belong here." The boy fled. The next morning, the priest confronted her gently, asking who she had been speaking to. There was a long silence before her answer came. "I am not alone in this cell," she said. The priest dismissed it as spiritual warfare. Fasting was increased. Prayers were intensified. The scratching grew louder, and sometimes it seemed to come from within the walls themselves. What began as whispers confined to stone did not remain there. The first to hear it was not the priest, but a widow who lived beside the churchyard. She woke in the depth of night to a faint, uneven tapping. At first she blamed the wind brushing against loose shutters, but the sound did not move with the breeze. It came in rhythm. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 3 more. The following evening, a blacksmith returning home after dusk paused outside the church walls. He heard something that made him step back into the fog. A voice, not loud, not screaming, but speaking through stone. By morning, rumors spread quietly through the market square. The anchoress was no longer the only one hearing movement. Villagers pressed their ears against the cold outer wall and swore they felt vibration beneath the surface, as though something shifted between the stones. The priest ordered silence. Fear, he warned, travels faster than truth. But fear had already rooted itself. One night, several men gathered with lanterns and stood beside the sealed chamber. They waited. For a long time, nothing happened. Then from behind the mortar and brick came a sound no one could mistake, a dragging scrape, slow, deliberate, not the scratching of rats, not settling stone, something heavier. And then a second voice answered hers. The silence came suddenly. For nearly 2 years, the anchoress had lived within stone and shadow. The villagers had grown accustomed to the unease, the tapping at night, the whispers carried through cracks in the mortar, the unsettling feeling that the church walls were no longer empty. But one morning, when the altar boy approached with bread and watered ale, there was no reply. He knocked softly against the small wooden hatch. Nothing. He called her name. Only stillness answered. The priest was summoned. He spoke prayers through the narrow slit facing the altar, his voice echoing gently into the confined chamber. He waited for her familiar response. None came. By evening, the villagers gathered once more with lanterns trembling in their hands. The priest insisted that solitude sometimes brought deep spiritual withdrawal. Fasting could weaken the body. Silence could be holy. Yet no one could ignore the cold truth pressing against their chests. She had stopped speaking, and still the sounds did not cease. That night, as the church bells marked the late hour, a low dragging echoed again from within the sealed wall, not frantic, not desperate, measured, almost patient. Several men stepped back from the stone in visible fear. If she no longer lived, then what continued to move inside that chamber? The priest's voice faltered for the first time, because something was still there, and it was not answering to prayer. After years of silence, the villagers could endure the unease no longer. The priest, trembling but resolute, gathered a small group of men with hammers and chisels. The stone wall that had sealed the anchoress's chamber for decades would be opened. They worked cautiously, brick by brick, listening for any sign of movement. The air grew heavy, the quiet of the churchyard oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. When the final stones were removed, they peered inside. The chamber was empty. No woman, no belongings, no cot, no crucifix, only a hollow space. Yet the smell lingered, iron and something darker, something almost alive, and then they saw it. On the far wall, faint scratches, long and deliberate, forming shapes that made no sense but seemed to convey warning. The mortar itself was cracked in patterns that hinted at movement, as if something had forced its way through stone from within. Villagers whispered, some crying, some backing away. "What has left this place?" one dared ask. No one answered. The priest pressed his hand to the wall, and a shiver ran up his arm. It was cold, colder than stone should ever be. From that day on, the villagers avoided the chamber. At night, some swore they could still hear faint dragging, faint breathing coming from the empty wall, an invisible presence reminding them that the line between life and confinement, faith and terror, had been crossed. The anchoress's fate would never be known, and the whispers never fully ceased.